We don't have a dorm. Oh, maybe we do. Good evening, everyone. It's good to see you all again. Tonight we've got Dad speaking for us on the miracle of the Jews' return, which should be very interesting. Before we hear from Dad, though, we'll sing hymn 318 and then we'll open in prayer. All right, let's open in prayer. Dear God above, thank you for the opportunity we've got to learn tonight, to learn some more about you and how you have worked with your people throughout history. Help us to be impressed tonight by your amazing power and the control you have over entire nations and countries. Help this to give us a renewed confidence in the hope you have offered us. And help us to look forward with anticipation to the time when your power will work with us to change us from mortal to immortal, and to bring about your kingdom. Help us to keep this vision strong in our minds and to be motivated to do our best to follow you as best we can now. Dear God, please bless Dad's work tonight and help him to explain your word well to us. And we ask this prayer through Jesus' name. Amen. As intro for Dad's talk tonight, we'll have Braden read for us Ezekiel 37 verses 1 to 14. And then we'll have Dad hop straight up.
Reading together with you all, Ezekiel 37 and the first 14 verses. The hand of Yahweh was upon me, and carried me out in the spirit of Yahweh, and set me down in the midst of the valley which was full of bones, and caused me to pass by them round about. And behold, there were very many in the open valley, and lo, they were very dry. And he said unto me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Adonai Yahweh, thou knowest. Again he said unto me, Prophesy upon these bones, and say unto them, O ye dry bones, hear the word of Yahweh. Thus saith Adonai Yahweh unto these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and ye shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will bring up flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and ye shall live. And ye shall know that I am Yahweh. So I prophesied as I was commanded. And as I prophesied, there was a noise, and behold, a shaking, and the bones came together, bone to his bone. And when I beheld, lo, the sinews and the flesh came up upon them, and the skin covered them above, but there was no breath in them. Then said he unto me, Prophesy unto the wind, prophesy, Son of man, and say to the wind, Thus saith Adonai Yahweh, Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they might live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived, and stood up upon their feet, an exceeding great army. Then he said unto me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, Our bones are dried, and our hope is lost. We are cut off for our parts. Therefore prophesy and say unto them, Thus saith Adonai Yahweh, Behold, O my people, I will open your graves, and cause you to come up out of your graves, and bring you into the land of Israel. And ye shall know that I am Yahweh, when I have opened your graves, O my people, and brought you up out of your graves, and shall put my spirit in you, and ye shall live, and I shall place you in your own land. Then shall ye know that I am Yahweh. I, Yahweh, have spoken it, and performed it, saith Yahweh.
Thanks, Braden, and thanks, my son. And good evening, everybody. We have a really wonderful subject tonight to delve in together. You know, we study many things together, don't we? And we wonder at the miracles of Scripture. But sometimes because we hear the same things over and over again and we're exposed to the same stories and events, even when they're completely miraculous, we can lose the wonder and the power of these events to persuade us that God is indeed at work. In our own little lives, we can sometimes lose sight of the fact that God can work in your and my life, even though we know he can do things on a grand, a magnificent scale. We can forget that he's in complete control, that his purpose is sure, and that the story of the survival and return of his people is able to underpin our faith and give us a rock-solid faith. And I hope this is part of the outcome tonight, is just to go back over these things and maybe to help us bring these things to people outside again, to be a confident witness to the things that we believe. So we want to review again tonight, outside of a lecture context, the miracle of the Jews' return to the land, that God, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, promised to their fathers. Now, in 45 minutes or so, this isn't going to be comprehensive, which isn't a great way to start, but hopefully compelling. So hopefully we can sit back and analyse what God has done and all these little miracles and the way they've added up to this great, majestic picture of bringing his people back to the land. These are the miracles as God describes them. He says that though Jerusalem would be sacked and the Jews dispersed throughout all the world, which is a big thing, isn't it, to move your people throughout the whole world, that they'd never lose their identity as Jewish people. They would always be considered Jews by themselves and by other people. And though they were punished and persecuted, they would never be destroyed. Jeremiah 30 says, Though I make a full end of all nations, whither I have scattered you, all the nations that you go into, yet will I not make a full end of thee. In time, God would regather them out of all the nations. That would be miraculous. Bring them not just to any old land, but back to the land of their fathers and establish them in full nationhood again. Not acting independently, but as a nation again. You know, it's important to note that what we're considering tonight in the restoration of the Jews to Israel and their re-establishment in the land is really a prophecy in part fulfilled, isn't it? And if you have a look at the passages on the return of Israel, you can sort of divide up the ones which are about the pre-eventual, before Jesus returns, and the ones after, or the ones that go all the way through, like our chapter tonight. It goes all the way through. The fuller return of the Jews and the establishment of the kingdom is promised in those places. So this work we're talking about tonight is only the partial work. Many more Jews will return to the lands. Their hearts have yet to be converted. That hasn't happened, and they haven't accepted their Messiah. And they will finally have Jesus, of the seed of Abraham, ruling as king in Jerusalem, on David's throne. All the promises come in together in full. You know, we know this quote so well from Elpis Israel, but Brother Thomas, in a previous Bible class, I remember Brother Nathan teasing this whole passage apart and bring all the passages together that shows how he comes up with this remarkable little summary of what will happen. But he understands the idea that there's a partial restoration of Israel before the return of Christ. There is then a partial and primary, which means initial, restoration of Jews before the manifestation of Christ, which is to serve as the nucleus or basis of future operations in the restoration of the rest of the tribes after he has appeared in the kingdom. The pre-adventual, before he comes, before Jesus comes, the pre-adventual colonisation of Palestine will be on purely political principles, not going back there because they're God's people and that they want to fulfil the promises to Abraham. It'll be on purely political principles. And the Jewish colonists will return in unbelief of the messiahship of Jesus and of the truth as it is in him. They will immigrate thither as agriculturalists, nothing wrong with that, and traders in the hope of ultimately establishing their commonwealth, but more immediately of getting rich in silver and gold by commerce with India, in cattle and goods by their industry at home under the efficient protection of the British power. So he understood really clearly from the Bible that there would be a whole lot of Jews returned to the land before Jesus came, and that other prophecies prophesied a fuller return, a restoration, a redemption, a unity with God after Jesus' return. So we'll build this little picture on the board up later. It's a little bit odd, I admit, at first glance, but we'll get there. I should just mention that. I should also just mention, while I've decided to do something introductory, that this book here, by Brother Jeff Henstock and Brother Sid Lebet from Victoria, Brother Sid is just a really fantastic summary of God's work with the Jews, the sign of his coming, the return of the Jews. I will recommend it. It's got all our classic quotes in there and lots of interesting little bits that they've put together. It's a great read, and it's for young people, it's very readable. It's one of the easiest things I've picked up to read. So, starting with the time of Jesus, the Jews were already right then in their own capital, weren't they? They were following the law, but with their own modifications. And they weren't willing to accept the Messiah, even though he walked their streets, he healed their sick, their lame, their blind, and even raised their dead to life. And they're just sitting there, weren't they, in Christ's day, holding on to the confidence that they were the people of God, Abraham's seed, to whom the land had been promised, and that's why they were there. But in their prophets, we know, and this one is Moses, if we come back to Deuteronomy 28, there were warnings, weren't there, that if they turned from God, that dire things would come upon them. And they had turned from God. Deuteronomy 27 and 28, God enumerates the blessings and the cursings, and both are overwhelming. The blessings, if they obeyed God, would overwhelm them. Everything would go well. And the cursings equally as dire in the extreme in the other direction. And so he says in Deuteronomy 28 and verse 15, after he's enumerated the blessings, but it shall come to pass, if you will not hearken unto the voice of Yahweh your God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes which I command you this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. Everything would go bad. Cursed in the city and in the field, in your store, and the fruit of your body. Everything would be cursed. And finally and fully, for their rebellion, if we come right across to verse 64, because the whole chapter's an expose of their history and what would happen because of their rebellion. Coming to our section that's relevant to the history tonight. And Yahweh shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of earth even unto the other. And there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. So when you're taking it across into the other nations and you're scattered like that, it wouldn't bring you back to God of itself. Even in dispersion, they would continue to serve other gods. And so he says in verse 65, and among these nations thou shalt find no ease, neither shall the sole of your foot have rest. But Yahweh will give thee there a trembling heart and failing of eyes and sorrow of mind, and your life will hang in doubt before you, and you'll fear day and night, and thou shalt have none assurance of your life, no guarantees. In the morning you would say, would God it were even, and at even thou shalt say, would God it were morning. For the fear of your heart, wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes, which thou shalt see. So terrible in the extreme, where your whole life is uncertain and you live in terror. This is the final outcome of full rebellion against God when he sends them into the nations. This is what he said. This is what he said in Deuteronomy. And our Lord Jesus Christ backed this up, didn't he, in Luke 21, that little expression. They shall fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. So Christ picks up that. He's applying Deuteronomy 28. He says, this is the situation you've got into. You've turned away from God, and now you'll be led away captive into all nations. His people had turned from him in their hearts, and he would fulfill the words of judgment and dispersal. So we often talk about AD 70 in our lectures. In AD 66, so just before that, the Jews started uprising against Vespasian, the Roman emperor. And eventually, by AD 70, he sent his son in, Titus, and he's just going to completely destroy Jerusalem. It's a fierce battle. There's lots of tussle. It's really interesting reading. The Jews are feisty. They don't give up. But it does turn into an incredible bloodbath. And Josephus estimates that 60,000 Jews died in these battles. They were bloody and they were drawn out, and the siege was terrible. And significantly, the temple was destroyed, many were carted off. But amongst those that remained in the land, and not everyone was carted off, in fact quite a lot stayed behind, not relative to the numbers in the land, but lots of people were left behind. They continue ebbing along and end up rebelling against the emperor, and by AD 135, the Emperor Hadrian. And things come to a head with Hadrian, and in the end he's going to go in, he sends his armies in to absolutely decimate whatever's left of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. There's a large-scale rebellion that's led by Simon Bar Kokhba in 132. And in the ensuing onslaught that comes back from Hadrian and his men, they believe about 500,000 Jews were killed. And at the end of that, he really stamps his authority on that area. He says, you're not going into Jerusalem. You're not allowed to have the Torah law in public. You're not allowed to use your Hebrew calendar. And anyone that was a scholar in Judaistic things, or who in Judaism, in the law, in the Torah, was executed. Many of the slaves were sold through the markets, so they took so many of these people off and they sold them through Europe in the markets throughout the empire. And he also renamed this area, which is Israel and Jerusalem. He renamed the region Syria-Palestine after the name of the Philistines. And you can imagine how that would offend the Jewish people, and later it was known as Palestine. So after AD 135, very few people remained, and that's probably where our picture starts here. So originally, they're in Jerusalem. This is just to build up a picture from a time frame. So we start there with Christ, and then the dispersion happens. We often talk about AD 70, but 135 under Hadrian was sort of the final solution at the time. So now, nationally, they're dead. The skeleton is dead. The skeleton of the nation, it's out in the valley to dry out, as we read in Ezekiel 37. And it's just going to get drier and drier till it's very dry out there. To all intents, the nation is without life, without any hope, without any future. It's drying in the sun for 1900 years. You know, it's really interesting reflecting on God's intentions versus where his people were actually at. It's interesting that before the Great Diaspora, before AD 70 and 135, there were more Jews living outside the land by choice than in it. So there's already at that point, before all of this, in Jesus' time, there's way more living outside the land than in the land. So there's already a choice by God's people to prefer to be somewhere else, other lands, rather than to be stuck with God's covenant or sticking to God's covenant. So there's a Jewish scholar who estimated that at the time there were 2 million Jews in Palestine, 4 million in the Roman Empire, and another 1 million in Babylonia and in non-Roman countries. This is at the time of Christ, or at the Great Dispersion, so it's 70 to 135. So huge numbers, the majority outside the land by choice, not following through with what God intended of his people right back in the beginning. And this is probably something that's sort of struck me as I asked the question the other day, well, why do they have to return? Why can't they stay elsewhere? Why can't they choose to go elsewhere? And I think the answer that I've come to out of Deuteronomy 28, and we'll look at a few other passages, is that God's plan doesn't work with his people outside the land. His covenant with them is not able to work. They're not able to be a holy nation if they're outside of the land and all dispersed. They have to be in his land, in his city, so that the son of David can sit on David's throne in Jerusalem, ruling over them. So, different to us, we have a freedom to move around in that sense. But I think that's not how God views it for his people. So left to themselves, considering the proportions of how few were really in the land as a proportion, what's that, 2 out of 7 million Jews, God's future, promised future with his people in his land would have fallen to the ground, left in the hands of the Jews themselves. But remember what Deuteronomy 33 said. God was not going to let this happen. Thus saith Yahweh, if you can break my covenant of the day and my covenant of the night, that there should not be day nor night in their season, then may also my covenant be broken with David my servant, that he should not have a son to reign on his throne, and with the Levites the priests my ministers. I've made a promise to David, and it's going to be fulfilled. And part of that is that the people need to be in the land to make it a national thing with David and his son upon the throne. Well, with the spread of the Roman Empire went beautiful roads, and the Greek language also facilitated the preaching of the gospel. So with the roads went the Jews. It was described that they sort of went on the coattails of the Roman army. So when they invaded somewhere, the Jews would follow in behind and start working in those areas. And so there was a massive diaspora, and these are just two maps. They're always a little bit clunky, these maps, but just showing that they really they didn't sort of just run away a safe distance. They really moved far and wide, and particularly right up into Eastern Europe and Western Europe of interest. Eastern Europe would get them into, or all of Europe would get them in trouble, but Russia would always be a very dark place, ultimately, for Jews. So they go into the Middle East and Africa. Some were still in Babylonia from the Babylonian exile. They went into Europe, they went into England, they went into Russia. And despite their willingness to go into these places, what we find is that they were rarely accepted entirely into the communities in which they moved. And so even early on in this period, even though they're moving into these communities and they want to be part of them and want to integrate, fairly soon on, we get what's called the ghetto established in Europe. It's named after a place in Venice where they put them in the foundry or the metalworking area of the city. And the Italian word for metal is ghetto, G-E-T-O. And so this term ghetto, G-H-E-T-T-O, became known, labelled as where you put people if you want to confine them and keep them separate from the rest of your society. So there are areas in the cities or towns where the authorities force the Jews to live, often in tough or deprived conditions because there's so many people confined to a small space and they didn't have freedom to move in and out very easily. So they'd be separated from non-Jewish populations, and especially Christians was part of the goal, was to keep Jews separate from Christians. So in these countries, they often had restricted occupations as well, usually farmers or craftsmen or tailors. they had an eye for money lending, and they often got into banking and money lending, but that often came back to bite them, because if the authorities went against the Jews in the area, they would pass edicts, and it happened at times where the Christians didn't have to repay the Jews for the money that they had borrowed from them, and so they'd be left shortchanged. So before the World Wars, by the end of the 19th century, start of the 20th century, there's approximately 6 million Jews in Europe. 2/3 of those are in Poland. Poland took in a lot of Jews. And they had taken them in when they were sort of persecuted elsewhere. They're a bit of a soft-hearted people, and they took the Jews in. And toleration then for the Jews sort of declined with time. And interestingly, it's often influenced by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was always, in its underlying disposition towards God people, anti-Semitic. And the Jews felt that all the time when they were in Europe. Until this man came along. This is a picture of a ghetto. So you can see it's walled in, it's busy, it's a bit of an enclave. You have to stay in this very limited area. And then Napoleon Bonaparte came along. Now, Napoleon is the Emperor of France, and he's spreading the freedom of the French Revolution, but also with Revelation 16 and the vials, he's bringing God's judgments on the Roman Catholic system. Well, as he was the commander of the French army at the time, later the emperor, he brought some liberty to minorities as he brought the spirit of the French Revolution with him. So he was terrorising Europe, but as he did that, he often released the Jews from ghettos and other small minorities, and with that came a loosening of some of the restraints that were upon them. They were able to get a bit more educated, get other forms of employment. And so as Napoleon moved through and the spirit of the French Revolution, the Jews were liberated and emancipated to some degree in various places. There was also what was called the Declaration of the Rights of Man by the Constitutional Assembly in 1789. And that was meant to guarantee, and of course it didn't always, but it was meant to guarantee freedom of religion and other civil rights to people, so that instead of just being able to treat someone how we expect to be treated in our society, to be treated well and respected, which they hadn't enjoyed, that was what was meant to follow from that declaration. So that brought new levels of freedom as well, and it decreased the power of the church, which had had so much control of people. So that, for example, in Portugal, synagogues were opened for the first time in 300 years. So there's an opening there, there's an opportunity for the Jews to express themselves in worship in a synagogue. So Jews then got access to schools and to universities, which they had largely been kept out of. The arts, the sciences, they're active-minded people, aren't they? So given half a chance and a bit of lead on the rope, away they go. And heaps more mixing in societies. And a lesser willingness to talk about their Jewishness and their origins. And so in the 1930s, so you think of the Holocaust, 1940s, late 39 to 45, by the late 1930s, Jews across Europe dominated many professions, so that in Hungary, where the population of the Jews was only 5% of the Hungarian population, they were 80% of the stockbrokers, 60% of the doctors, and 50% of the lawyers. So where there's an opportunity to rise to the top, the Jew often will, and for that he's not always seen favourably. They would often go into banking, and it's not too hard to then paint a successful Jew as a villain, as a greedy person. And that happened as well. So that brings me to explain the rest of my whiteboard here. So this is meant to be two little enclaves. This is before Napoleon, and this is sort of after. So this is sort of AD 135 to 1790s when Napoleon came on. you would be staying in your house here, and the church man would be looking over you here from his place and having some control over you. And your occupations would be, what did we say? Farming, tailors, craftsmen. But when Napoleon came along, so this is meant to be a flow, but I should use a big ruler. Then all of a sudden you're going out to be a lawyer, or a doctor, or a banker. And the effect of the church, the influence of the church is greatly diminished as represented by a small house with no man looking over your backyard. So this is just meant to give a visual, so this is Napoleon and the French Revolution. The French Rev. Okay, so I hope that helps a little bit. It just sort of shows how things went. They were securing Jerusalem, but they turned away from God. They're scattered. They end up sort of in ghetto life, but with Napoleon, there's opportunity to get out and to grow. And this, of course, starts to bother traditionalists in these areas. The Jews' newfound engagement and success that the revolution had facilitated in the long run would not bode well for their future. And that's where God brings on the scene the next man in his plan and purpose, Theodor Herzl. He's born in 1860. He's not born into poor circumstances. He's born into a wealthy banking family in Budapest. And he's really the man that put the idea of going back to the land back on the agenda. The Jewish people as a whole had pretty much completely abandoned the idea of going back to their land. He had a law degree, he grew up in a well-to-do family, he was educated, he was confident. He grew up in the Jewish community, but he really wanted to mix with the high flyers, the upper levels of European society. And he became a journalist for a leading Austrian newspaper. And so God has chosen in him someone that's very eloquent, and he's able to market the concept of Zionism to people in authority, to rulers, to statesmen, to financiers, the sort of people the Jewish people needed to get back to the land. And he wasn't actually particularly at all religiously motivated, but he did see the persecution of the Jews, especially in Eastern Europe, and he could see that in Russia that was growing and that their restrictions were being reinstated. And he saw that even though some Jews did all they could with their brains and their art and their skills to assimilate into European society, they were often not truly accepted. They'd get so far, and then people would turn against them for their success or their prosperity or just for their race. And as we said, they're often associated with trading with money and an easy target for being called greedy or mistrusted. So Theodor Herzl could see what was happening and started to create, him and other men, Zionist societies. And I'd put funds together to try to facilitate people moving back to the land. Herzl had really dreamed that the Enlightenment might have changed the fortunes of the Jews, but he came to realise that just wasn't going to happen. There was something about the Jews that would always keep them, some degree, isolated from their societies. And he was a journalist that covered the Dreyfus affair, the Jewish man, the French Jewish army captain, Alfred Dreyfus, who was falsely accused of espionage, of spying for the Germans. And he was stripped of his colours and position, and the crowd, and this is what really rung in Herzl's ear, the crowd were so feverish about that, and what they were crying out was, "Death to the Jew." And I think that seems so extreme to him, that that's what they should be targeting, that he was a Jew and that they actually wanted him killed, and it was a mob hysteria. And I think that shocked him into realising that Jews could never be truly assimilated. And so they needed another plan. Assimilation was never going to be a permanent solution. And so in 1897, another one of the famous dates, he called for the first Zionist Congress. It was in Basel, Switzerland. There were 204 delegates from 15 countries. And we're told that he made them all dress up because he wanted this not to be some shabby affair. He wanted them all to look smart and for this to really get on the map. And he made sure with his connections that all the leading journalists from the leading newspapers were there as well, because he needed advertising of this whole concept of Zionism and the return to Israel. And so the World Zionist Organization was established, and the Basel Declaration was approved. And the declaration here stated that that the Zionist movement's goal was to establish a homeland for the Jewish people under public law, protected by public law. And so he included a synopsis of Jewish history, which included biblical and historical and legal justification for the establishment of the Jewish state in the land of Israel. You could go back through their history and build a case for that. Because Israel was under the occupation of the Turkish Empire, and it had been for 400 years. So this was one of the hurdles that had to be overcome. How do you get the Jews back into land occupied by the Turkish people? Well, there were up to 50,000 people of Jewish origin already in the land. They were farming, but it was really tough, and it's actually quite astounding that people ever really went back to the land. If you're thinking about the lush Adelaide Hills or meadows or any pretty place around South Australia, there was none of that by nature in the land. It was a tough place, except a little bit up north, but it was a tough place to go back. It was full of marshes that needed draining, and so it had mosquitoes and malaria. There were local hostilities. Your neighbours didn't like you. They didn't want you there. It is surprising that people went back if God wasn't working behind all of this. But the Zionist movement here and this first Zionist Congress sowed the seed for the new state. And in the confidence of the momentum that came out of that, we know that Herzl said, "In Basel, I founded the Jewish state," which he didn't, he just talked about it. But he says, "I founded the Jewish state. Maybe in 5 years, certainly in 50, everyone will realise it. Everyone will realise that this was the springboard. This was the seedbed of the ideas for going back to the land." And we know 50 years later, so this is 1879, what happened in 1947? What happened in 1947? Yeah, okay, so there's a UN declaration and a partition plan put for the land of Israel to give the Jews a place in the land of Israel. So he was right, under the good hand of God. Well, in 1904, Herzl dies. He was only 44, just a young man. The stress of his work and he had a weak heart brought his life to an end. But he had a big funeral that had 6,000 people attend. And a lot has been written about this man, which was clearly raised up by God, driven, effective, able to speak, able to convey his ideas. And there's a historian that a well-known historian, wrote this little spiel about Herzl, which I thought you'd enjoy. "It was Zionism articulated for the first time by a man of the world," so mixing with the world, "a distinguished political observer and profoundly travelled journalist. The Judenstaat, the Jewish state, the book he wrote, therefore, in its transfixing eloquence and orderly exposition, introduced Zionism to European readers, to editors, university men, statesmen, and other moulders of public opinion, in the kind of language they are accustomed to reading. More important yet, Herzl stood alone in his attempt to resolve the Jewish question not merely through the dramatic and far-reaching notion of a Jewish state, but through the active collaboration of leading European powers. He knew that he needed backers for his plan. From the very outset, he projected Zionism into the international statecraft." So he was the man raised up by God and acknowledged so in that little reference. So despite all of this, actually, his ideas were not well received by everyone in Jewry. You know, they had been saying every year, next year in Jerusalem, at their Passover celebrations, but in actual fact, in Western Europe particularly, there were precious few that ever really seriously thought about going back until the Holocaust came along. So it might not seem at this point that really anything's been achieved by Herzl's work, but he's planted the seeds which had long been abandoned. And I think that's one thing I've learned, is how much the Jews had just let go of their previous hope. It wasn't dominant in their hearts any longer. They had let go of it. And in the late 19th century that we're talking about, almost 100%, 99.7% of the world's Jews lived outside the land of Israel in that region. So nearly everyone, there was hardly anyone, percentage-wise, 0.3% were living in the land. But you can see from this next little chart, which you just need to see that it doesn't have much on it, is what you're trying to get out of this for a long time, that there hadn't been many people going back to Zion at all right up until the 1930s. And the ones that did, they came mostly from the harsher European countries, from Russia and from Poland. Those in Western Europe, as we said, weren't really interested in immigration. And those that did return, the land, because it was so hard to get up and running and make it profitable, they're actually almost entirely dependent on sponsorship by families like the Rothschild family, which were a family of wealthy Jewish bankers in the British House of Lords, and small groups like the Christadelphians, and plenty of others who believed in their cause and sent money to support them. So it was tough, it was a grind for a long time in the land. It certainly wasn't the land flowing with milk and honey that you might picture in your mind from the land today. Well, another little miracle in the story, so these are the Aliyahs, the early Aliyahs, in 4 stages as they came up. And actually, quite a few that came up in those Aliyahs went back again when they had an opportunity, because things were so difficult in the land. So, the next miracle in the story is the birth of Eliezer ben Yehuda, and he was a Lithuanian-born Zionist. He was a Jew born in Lithuania, and he became a Zionist. You know, he is the man that is the father of the modern Hebrew language. Hebrew had hardly been spoken for 2,000 years since the diaspora. And he just understood that language would help link people back with their heritage, and all that meant to them, and their sense of identity. And so he wanted to revive this ancient and pretty much dead language. And he didn't just want to, it was used obviously for Bible students, people that would study the Old Testament, they needed to know Hebrew, but he wanted to get it right back to the point of use for modern conversation. So he studied in Europe, and one day he was in Paris in 1877, we're told, and he met a Jew from Jerusalem, and they had a conversation, because he was a student, they had a conversation in Hebrew. And he thought, this can be done. He was astounded, and he became convinced that he could revive the language of Hebrew as a contemporary spoken language, and not just one learnt to read old texts by. So he's a Zionist by now, and he felt really that the Hebrew language went hand in hand with the re-establishment of the state, to be used by the state in all its official functions, and also amongst the people out on the street. And so in 1881, he went to live in Palestine, where you might expect to get some pretty positive response. But he actually got huge opposition from secular Zionists, so the people that are not believing in God, but they do believe in the cause of Zionism, and also Orthodox Jews, those that stuck to the law. Both classes, and you might think the Orthodox Jew would welcome the old language. He was even opposed by Herzl himself. Herzl, he loved the German way and the German people, And he thought German should be the language of the Jewish state because he loved Germany and their civilization, and he also wanted the Kaiser's support. So, as with any colony, if it speaks the same language as the parent company, then you've got their sympathy and you can communicate properly. And on the other hand, Orthodox Jews thought that turning Hebrew into modern spoken language was a desecration of the language, and that it should only be used for prayer and for study and not be used for the mundane or for any profane contexts. Well, he pushed on anyway and compiled the first Hebrew dictionary, and he didn't live to finish it. His second wife completed it, and it was published in 1908. And he raised in his family, he's known to have raised his son, called Ben Zion, raised his son, only being allowed to speak Hebrew in the home. Now, one of the interesting things he's had to do is to create words for modern conversation. So they didn't talk in the Bible about refrigerators or cars or electricity or anything like that. So he went back through the Hebrew and Aramaic and Arabic roots of words and tried to get words that would connect in a logical, seamless way or a meaningful way with the things that we were creating in our generation that he needed names for. So then the language would be relevant and also still deeply rooted in its origins. So this is the language that the Israelis use today in Zion. Now I'm not sure about, I'd be happy to have a chat about this. I'm not sure if this is the pure language that Zephaniah is talking about in Zephaniah 3 and verse 9. For then I'll turn to the people a pure language. In the Hebrew it means, then I'll restore to the nations a pure lip. So it might be more about the way they speak. That they may call upon the name of Yahweh to serve him with one consent, i.e. with one shoulder, that is side by side. So might talk more about the unity of the language and the purity of the way they speak than the actual language itself. But either way, I'm not sure why God would change the language either. I can't think of a clear reason why you wouldn't use traditional Hebrew if we're going to speak one language in the kingdom. So then, having established a language and made it colloquial and conversational, it was able to be used in schools and used in society. And apparently, modern Hebrew is very similar to ancient Hebrew in the same way that modern English is similar to Shakespeare. So it's not exactly the same. You need a little getting used to it. Grace wouldn't mind. She'd probably prefer Shakespeare. It keeps your mind active, trying to work out exactly what he's saying. So there's there's not much gap between Old Hebrew and modern Hebrew. They're very similar. So this, I think, is another little significant resurrection miracle, isn't it, in the restoration of Israel, to have their own language. And that, in actual fact, is going to make them more dependent on each other and less able to integrate, ultimately, isn't it? Because they'll speak their own language. Well, in 1917, we come along to the Balfour Declaration. Turkey was occupying Palestine. It had been an ally with Britain in earlier times, but in World War I, it changed sides and fought against Britain. And in 1917, then Britain defeated Turkey and freed up Jerusalem and Palestine out of the hands of the Turkish people and into the hands of the British. And once the British had control of Palestine, then the Zionists got stuck into the British because they knew they would be more favourable towards them. And so the Zionist leader, Cain Weizmann, secured this pledge from the governor of Great Britain to support the Zionist appeal for a homeland in Israel. And this appeal, this little letter, is known as the Balfour Declaration, and it's named after the British Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour. Now, you can't read it there, but it's just for authenticity that we put the old version up there. It says, "Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations." Imagine if you heard this off the platform out of an Australian Prime Minister's lips in Canberra, that we're sympathetic with Jewish Zionist aspirations. It's a big leap, isn't it? Down this pathway of supporting the Jewish people, which has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. So the British are behind the restoration of Israel to the land of Israel, or Palestine as it was. His Majesty's government view with favour, this is a big thing to do for a leading power in the world to say this. His Majesty's government view with favour, doesn't mean we're going to 100% back it right now, they speak very carefully. We view with favour the establishment in Palestine, not in Uganda or anywhere else, in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So it's got people in there already, it's got Palestinians, Arabs in there already, but this is to say we're also going to put the Jewish people back in that land. And we'll use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. We're going to come in and back it. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, read the Arabs, the Palestinians, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation, yours, Arthur Balfour. So this is exactly what they needed. The Jewish people needed the backing of a big world power. And now 30 years, this is 1917, 30 years is going to pass between this written support by Britain and the declaration of the State of Israel. And God's clock at times ticks slowly, doesn't it? And we wonder. And it took World War II and the atrocities that occurred then to drive this into reality. And we'll come to, that's sort of where we come to, is to World War II now and the Holocaust. And I just wanted to spend half a moment. We had a question in the BYG question session that we didn't get to last week. And the question was this. We had lots of good questions, actually, 14 of them. This was one we didn't get to. Why did God allow such sad things like the Holocaust to happen to the Jews? Couldn't he have chosen a way that was less violent? Well, God had a plan with his people, as we said, didn't we? They were his witnesses in the land that he had promised them. They were his people, and they were covenanted to be a holy nation. And that's what Exodus 19 said, didn't it? Moses went up to God, and Yahweh called him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus shalt thou say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel," this is where he makes the covenant with them, seals it in chapter 24, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself." I brought you to this place, to myself. I think they're associated in God's mind, aren't they? "Now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a special treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests, and an holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel." So this is what God wanted. He wanted a nation, a people, a kingdom of priests in one place to represent him and to live out his principles and to obey him. But in their dispersion, the Jews had abandoned their faith and their Messiah and the hope of Israel. They still had their Jewish identity, but they didn't have it in belief. And many didn't want to return to the land, even when they had the chance. They had let go of this almost entirely. They had lost their vision, they had forgotten this covenant. They wanted to be Russians, actually, or they wanted to be Europeans and not Jews and known to be God's people. And so for all the hardship and the terror they experienced, nothing happened to the Jewish people that they had not been told about. And we read about that in Deuteronomy 28. It doesn't get much worse than having terror before your eyes night and day and unable to sleep. They had been warned of the degree of suffering that they would go through. It was all laid out in Deuteronomy 28. And the facts are that many could have returned before the Holocaust. There was opportunity and many could have returned if they wanted to fulfill the terms of the covenant that they had made with God back in Exodus. So I hope that helps go some distance down the path to explain why such strong means were used to bring them back to the land. God had said that he wanted them to stay in the land. He wanted them to be obedient. But even when they had an opportunity to come back to the land, they didn't have their heart towards God. They didn't want to take up this covenant. They would have all let it fall to the ground, his words and his promises. And so we come to the Holocaust, which we're not really going to deal with particularly tonight. But the word Holocaust means a sacrifice consumed by fire, from a Greek word, translating the Hebrew word olah, or burnt offering. So holocauston. It's a Greek word translating the Hebrew word for burnt offering. So they could have come back, many of them, but they didn't. But through the atrocities of the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, and the Holocaust, and the murder of 6 million Jews under the final solution scheme of Hitler's Nazi regime, this was a shocking time, and there's no doubt about that. It was grueling, it was hopeless, it was an unending nightmare that kept getting worse and worse. And so after the Holocaust in 1948, the Jews, many of them, were finally keen to flow back to the land. And so we get this chart, which shows what happens, the effect of the World War II and the Holocaust on the Jews and their aliyahs. We have this massive return from the work of Herzl and right through to the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Look at the spike in 1948. Now, the British are now in control, aren't they? They've taken over from the Turks and they're in control in the land, and they're trying to keep the peace there with the Arabs, because the Arabs and the Jews are fighting. They're trying to actually restrict Jewish importations or immigration, because there's just so many of them coming, and they're trying to sneak them in through every back door they possibly can. The Jews seriously got busy about that, and it was getting pretty out of control for the British. And they were trying to restrict access wherever they could. And there was this ongoing civil war before 1948 between the Jews and the Arabs. It was simmering along all the time under the background, right under the noses of the British. And they were trying to stay neutral and keep the Arabs on side. They had promised not to jeopardise their civil and religious rights. And so they had to look like they were being even-handed. But things finally got too hot for the British, and they finally announced that they were leaving only 2 weeks before they intended to go. And they were going to hand Palestine over to the UN without any particular handover of power. And so they say that they are going to leave, and they leave right on May 14, 15, 1948. It takes a little while for them all to leave, but that's where they start hanging up the flags or pulling down the flags and moving on. They've largely given up on this area. They can't control it, and they just hand it over to the UN. So they announced that they're leaving on May 15, 1948. Well, the wars, the Arabs are aware of this, and they've been working furiously up to this time. And after the announcement, before the announcement and before May 15, the Arabs were attacking the Jews wherever they could in Jerusalem. There was food scarcity and things were getting desperate. But the Jews were also trying to push out the other way, and they captured Haifa and Jaffa, and then the Arab states start moving in towards the borders of Palestine because they think they're about to start up a holy war. Apparently at the time, just before May 14, half of the Syrian army were in Israel, and they'd captured the Galilee. And then in May 11, the Egyptians jumped in, they mobilised their army, they were very confident, and Ben-Gurion started to get really worried in Tel Aviv. Transjordan posed a big threat to them as well because their army was organised and well disciplined. And so in the middle of all of this, and with this announcement, Ben-Gurion, right on the day of pullout, decides that he's going to make his great announcement, the declaration of the State of Israel, a declaration of independence. And David Ben-Gurion was the Prime Minister of Israel. And he knew that even though this was a tough moment to do it, this was the moment to do it, immediately as the British left. He had to express a deep Zionist and Jewish justification for the renewed statehood. And he wrote feverishly right into the late of the night so that he could do this grand address to announce the State of Israel. And you know the expression, he does it by virtue of our natural and historical right. He says, we've got the right to this, and we're going to follow through exactly as you'd expect us to based on our history. So it's one thing to do all of this when you've got the British support, but as soon as the Brits are gone, you've made the statement and you're going to have to protect your new state. And he already knew, well before he stood up to do that speech, that the very next day, on May 15, 1948, the surrounding Arab states would start a full-scale invasion of the Jewish territories. And the Jews were, in a number of their wars, they seriously weren't sure they were going to win, and certainly in this one. So they weren't allowed weapons, so all of those had to be smuggled in parts and then assembled, and all that had to be done last minute so that it couldn't be found by the Brits and couldn't be thrown away or got rid of before this crucial moment of their statehood was announced. So immediately, right on May 14, the Arabs rejected the partition plan, and on the night of May 14, they launched an air attack on Tel Aviv, which the Israelis resisted. But then the fight was on, and Egypt came in, and Iraq and Transjordan and Syria from the Arab areas. So they were obviously welcomed into the Arab areas of Palestine, and they were able to fight from those areas and therefore get better access to the Jewish areas. You know, when you put all those people together, they're supported by the Arab Liberation Army and corps from Saudi Arabia and Lebanon and Yemen. Put that together with Egypt, Iraq, Transjordan and Syria, and you've got a big force on your hands. It's the combined backing, not 50 million people, but the backing of 50 million people against 650,000 Jews. And these people have fighter jets and tanks and heaps of foot soldiers. So they're astounding odds, aren't they? 650 against a force backed by 50 million Arabs. Well, many leading figures looking at this situation, including the British, just assumed that it'd all be over inside of 2 weeks and that the Jews would lose. But they kept fighting right through to February of the next year. And they never really, Israel and the Arab states didn't reach any formal armistice until February the following year. Well, in the wash-up, the partition plan had been put to them just before statehood was announced. The Palestinians had rejected the partition plan, but in actual fact, if that's clear enough to you, you can see what the partition plan would have given to the Arabs on the left, and the Jews in the purple bits end up encroaching right beyond the partition plan into areas that the UN had proposed for the Arab state. So by the end of the war, the state of Israel controlled all of the area that the UN had proposed for the Jewish state, as well as almost 60% of the area proposed for the Arab state. And the Jewish borders at the end of the war were 37 times larger than originally decided by the UN in 1947. And not surprisingly, the Arabs called this war Al-Nakba, which means the catastrophe, because things had really, really gone backwards. They probably could have held out a whole lot better, or they would have if they had have accepted the partition plan. And Jerusalem becomes a divided city with Jordan and Israel each taking a portion. So that's the War of 1948, a miracle on this very young fledgling nation that doesn't have much organisation, doesn't have tanks and aircraft and all that sort of thing to fight with. They're just putting it together with grit and determination and a whole lot of God working behind them, whether or not they acknowledged it. Well, they survived the Suez Crisis in 1956 when Egypt tried to block the Suez and deny access for their ships in and out of Israel. And then we come to the Six-Day War in 1967. And Israel's really burdened at that time with the growing population and hostile neighbours. The two things are coming together. There's not enough productivity in the country to easily support the population, and then they've got hostile neighbours around them as well. And the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organisation, got established as a political sort of antagonism to Israel at the time as well. They didn't accept their statehood, and they had the sympathies of Syria and Egypt as well. Well, in May 17, 1967, Egypt demanded that the UN that had taken over looking after Palestine after the Brits had left. Egypt demanded that the UN remove its peacekeeping force from the Sinai Peninsula, and they did that. They had to, because they were asked to by the owners. And they went down then, the Egyptians, and promptly cut off Israel's access to the Red Sea. And Israel could see that they had Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Syria and Iraq and the PLO now all aligned against them with Egypt. And that was an overwhelming force. And they realised that the odds were stacked too high against them to really have any opportunity of winning this war. In fact, so many Israeli deaths were expected as they faced this force and reckoned with it all and tried to put it all together, that apparently all of the public parks in Jerusalem were designated as cemeteries by the rabbis in advance, so they were consecrated or whatever, so they could be. The parks were consecrated to be cemeteries. That's what they expected to happen out of the 67 war. And Israel, as we know, they decided to do a preemptive attack, which is always exciting to read about. So on June the 5th, 1967, Israel launched a blitzkrieg against its enemies, an intense military campaign without any warning. At breakfast time, 7:45 in the morning, they only had a quarter of the air force of their opponents, but early on June the 6th, Israel sent 200 planes towards the Egyptian air bases to smash up their planes to try to get some early advantage in the war. Now, interestingly, I didn't know this part of the story, but they tried to fly low enough to avoid detection by radar, but the planes were actually spotted visually by the Jordanians. But apparently the coding frequencies had just been changed the day before, and so the messages as the Jordanians tried to warn the Egyptians never got through, and so Israel were able to sail in, even though they'd been spotted by the Jordanians, and take out half of the Egyptian air force, which gave them great air supremacy. So the attack was so successful and set that war up on a really good footing for Israel. Now it's called the 6-Day War, and it had to be quick because everyone was called up that could possibly be mobilised for that war. And the country actually couldn't afford just to have everyone so entirely focused just on that. So it had to be quick, and with God's blessing it was. Well, what's the result of this battle? That within 60 hours, Israel had tripled their territory. Within 60 hours, just over 2 days, they had tripled their territory. They had gained the Sinai Desert, they had reopened the Straits of Tiran that had been shut to them, and they controlled most of the territory held by Jordan on the West Bank, and they had gained full control of Jerusalem. So by June 10, just 6 days later, the fighting came to a halt. What a remarkable battle. And we know God works behind this, but, Israel is full of atheists, and they always were, even back in these times. After reporting in detail on the remarkable events of the short war, the military correspondent for Haaretz newspaper, in the analysis of events, concluded that even a non-religious person must admit this war was fought with help from heaven. So God is at work, and that becomes obvious even to the unbeliever. So this partially fulfills then, doesn't it, the prophecy in Luke 21 of our Lord. They'll fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations, that we quoted before, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And really in its totality, there's still plenty of Gentiles treading down Jerusalem. There's a Muslim and Arab quarter still in Jerusalem. I suspect the full fulfilment of this prophecy is when it is just the people of God and the true religion. So then finally we come to the 1973, the Yom Kippur War. And in this case, the Arabs kept a very good secret, and Syria and Egypt agreed to launch a simultaneous attack on Israel at 2 p.m. on Saturday, October 6. And they chose this day because it was the Sabbath, and it was Yom Kippur. It was the Day of Atonement, which is the holiest day in the Jewish catalogue. calendar. And the Jews, particularly at this time, were taking that really seriously. They were really controlling their activities down to not much, focusing on the Day of Atonement. And the Jews only found out about this at 4 o'clock in the morning on the same day. Yom Kippur at the time meant there'd be no broadcasting, there'd be no commercial activity, and almost no other travel other than probably the prescribed day's journey between people's houses or the synagogue. So they really were in shutdown. And the point is made that actually in trying to gather everyone together, maybe that partially worked to their advantage as well because they knew where everyone was. They were either at home with their family or at the synagogue. But they had to muster very quick. They had to mobilise and they had to get down to the Suez Canal. And as a result of this sort of starting on the back foot, for a week they really struggled. And in the second week they started to turn around, and finally after 3 weeks Israel had not only repulsed the Egyptian attacks but had crossed the canal and they were heading towards the capital of Cairo. So that was in the south against Egypt, and in the north against Assyria. They had gone through the Golan Heights into Syria and were marching towards Damascus. And, you know, they were backed well. Egypt and Syria were backed well. They had the Soviet Union behind them. They had Iraq and Jordan. But Israel held its ground, and a ceasefire was implemented on both fronts on October 24 in the same year. You know, this is a war that has that interesting story about the landmines. And apparently it's a true story. It's told in the DVD series Against All Odds, which I can't guarantee the whole lot of, but I've watched parts of it. It's really good. And the story is of Israeli troops making their way through the Golan Heights near the Syrian border. And it was a dark night in this battle in 1973. And as the troops made their way across the field, they suddenly realised that the field was mined. Hundreds of landmines all around them. So if they stepped out of place, they'd be blown to pieces. So they started unhooking the landmines with their pocket knives and digging up and disarming landmines. Wouldn't like that job, but that's what you do in wartime. But suddenly a very strong windstorm blew up of desert sand, and it shut them down pretty much as people. That was too much sand in their nose and in their ears and eyes to be able to operate, and they just had to sit pretty for a while until it passed. But when that windstorm passed and they opened their eyes and looked out, what they saw was that all the landmines in the whole field had been uncovered by the wind. So the sand that had been swept over them to cover them up had all been uncovered, and they were then able to plot their course through the field and make their way to their destination. So, an interesting little thing, but this is maybe stormy winds fulfilling his word. So, brothers and sisters and young people, God's people, preserved since AD 70 and AD 35, through the dispersal, they've been brought back to their land, haven't they? And our faith is bolstered as we watch God's plan work out with them. He makes promises and he keeps them. He makes warnings too and he keeps them. God has massive plans and he fulfills them. And he often does that through miraculous means over thousands of years. And yet his people are still in unbelief. You know, in Ezekiel 37, it's only a partial fulfillment. In verse 14, which we read at the end there, he said, "And I shall put my spirit in you, and you shall live, and I will place you in your own land. Then you shall know that I, Yahweh, have spoken it and performed it." And God hasn't done that yet. He hasn't got to their heart and put his spirit in them. And they haven't acknowledged that God is behind it all. He's spoken it and performed it. They still believe that they survive by their own wit, their skill, their ingenuity, and their merits. But God is still going to make them one nation upon the mountains of Israel with one king, a king to them all. And so we're left both amazed and from that, I think, warned. Because if God deals with his natural seed, the children of Abraham, the ones he loves, in that graphic way that we've been through tonight, then he expects us to, here in our comfort, to believe, to hold on to his work with us and to his promises. Not to try to assimilate into the world and be the same as them, but to keep the covenant he has made with us, to be a holy people, a special treasure. to show forth the praises or the virtues of him who has called us out of darkness into his marvellous light.
Thanks for that, Dad. It is truly amazing to see how God's hand against impossible odds has preserved Israel the whole way through history. We'll now have the announcements from Uncle Dave, I think.
Thanks, brother, for that. It never ceases to amaze the whole story and bring it all together like a Reader's Digest, compact in one discussion. It's really good. So, collection for tonight is for Hebron. Now, God willing, our next class on the 13th of November, our Zechariah series. Let your hands be strong. Brother Tim Badgers to lead us. Not too much on. There's tomorrow night the Heritage College Twilight Celebrations. Parents and friends are running that. Saturday, the suburban young people are having an outing at 1:30, Blair National Park. Brings us to Sunday. Brother Merv Islip is to give the exhort in the morning. Brother Steve Dowling's to chair, Brother Phil Archer's to read, and Brother Pete Pullman's to be on the music, and in the lecture, Brother Pete Osborne's to give that talk.
Thanks for that, Uncle Dave. To finish off our night tonight, we'll sing hymn 376 and then we'll close in prayer. Let's close in prayer. Dear God, thank you for the evidence of your mighty hand we have seen tonight. You truly are all-powerful. You have preserved Israel, your peculiar treasure, despite humanly impossible odds. And God, you have called us to be a part of your peculiar people, to be a holy nation. And this is such a blessing that we have the same mighty hand that has preserved Israel the whole way through history, looking after us, if we but choose you and choose to be part of your holy nation and peculiar people. Help us to trust in you and take joy and peace in this fact. Dear Father, Thank you for the supper we have to share now tonight. Please bless the fellowship we have together now, and please bring us all home safely tonight as well. We ask this prayer through Jesus' name. Amen.